Okay, so today we are working on the GMC Terrain. I'm going to be removing the spark plugs, or doing spark plug service. First thing we're going to do is remove the engine cover and get any debris off the intake manifold. You don't want anything falling into the engine. So, once that is done, we're going to remove the air ducting, two 8mm bolts, and I've actually already removed the positive crankshaft ventilation breather hose from the little air tank already. I'll show that later, but just got to remove that part. The air ducting, you can leave the air box in place, just remove the ducting. Once I do that, I'm just using a body trim removal clip to disconnect the harness in the front two Christmas tree clips and two on the side, on the driver's side of the manifold. Just got a couple clips that hold it to the intake manifold. You need to pop those out. Once you do that, we're just removing a couple 10mm bolts that hold the power steering reservoir mount to the intake manifold. Once you undo the three 10mm bolts, you can just lift it up and position it to the side. No fluid will have to be removed. And I got a little bit of a rat's nest I got to clean out here. Make sure you get any of that out. You don't want that falling down in. The coolant bleed pipe, there's two 10mm bolts that hold that down. I've already removed them. You gotta get that up away from the manifold. It can stay on, you just have to disconnect it from the intake manifold itself. Now we're going after the rear PCV hose. As you saw, it's the same kind of connection as the front. Remove it from the valve cover, and you can choose to actually remove it by sliding it clockwise at a 90-degree angle, and it'll pop out of the manifold. I choose it, just makes it easier for removal for me. Now we got this brake booster vacuum hose and the connection on the throttle body that we had to remove. So I'm just using small pliers, removing the brake booster vacuum hose. Can be a little stubborn to get off, but once they wiggle, you can just pull it right off. And just make sure that's positioned out to the side. Sometimes I actually use the pliers to pull the hose physically away from the manifold. Just make sure you don't break the plastic nipple on the manifold. And then at this point, I'm actually going to remove the throttle body connector. There's a safety clip that won't let you remove it until that's removed. Slide that connector away. And there's a little Christmas tree clip that holds it to the manifold. You got to remove that too. Then there is the evap purge solenoid connections. There's one evap line that is a quick release, and then just one little connector. Couldn't really get a good shot of filming. I do have an evap P0496 video that shows this if you need those instructions. And at this point, removing the 6 13mm bolts. These are long bolts. This will actually release the upper intake manifold, or the intake manifold itself. To do this, the manifold will come loose, but it's really hard to remove it with the bolts in place. I kind of knock them up a little bit and then just remove all the bolts. This makes it so you don't have any interference when removing the actual intake manifold. Just going to lift the coolant bleed pipe up, and you should be able to just wiggle that intake manifold right out of there. At this point, I choose to put a rag over the intake manifold ports, or the cylinder head ports. You don't want anything actually falling in there. So yeah, red shop rag. Just cover the ports, and this keeps any debris from falling in there, or bolts or anything. Now we're going to be removing all the connectors to the 6 coil packs. There's 3 on each side, V6. Remove the safety clips, and they should all just easily remove. Do the same thing to the rear. Then just remove the 10 millimeter bolts that hold the coil pack actually in place. Check the boots for any damage. Make sure there's no cracking or heavy oil residue. And if they're good, you just position them to the side. Then I am slowly releasing the spark plug with my ratchet spark plug socket. On this one, my magnetic spark plug socket actually chose to not grip the spark plug. After I've released them, I'm using a power drill to slowly remove them. Don't be an idiot here. I'm just speeding this up. Just slowly backing them out, and then because my spark plug socket didn't grip them, I just use a magnet to get the plugs out. Do the same thing to the rear. Again, check the coil packs for any damage. And just removing those spark plugs. Okay, now I've actually started I put the new spark plugs in already. I'll have a link in the description for those plugs and the gap. And we're just starting them by hand. Put them in by hand and do the final torque by hand. Don't use any power tools to actually put the spark plugs in, or you can risk cracking them or damaging the cylinder head. And these are long threaded spark plugs. It can take a little bit. Just threading them in. Just gonna continue to do each one. I just kind of snug them down. Back ones, I can't get that swooping effect, so it take a little bit to go back in. And then we're just gonna continue with the final torque. And make sure the spark plugs are all snug and tight. You don't want to over crank them. All the torque spec in the description. I'm just gonna reposition all the coil packs back in place and start hand threading the bolts into the valve cover. You don't want to just cross thread those or anything into those brass inserts. You'll just snap the valve cover. Just position all the coil and plug assemblies. And then tighten them all down. Then we're going to reconnect all the coil packs and put any safety clips that you removed. Make sure they're engaged so that they don't actually have the ability to back out, because once the intake manifold is over the rear ones, you won't be able to get back to them without removing the intake manifold. Or you can, but you won't be able to see them. So just make sure they're all secured so they can't possibly back out. Now we're actually going to remove the intake manifold gasket. You don't need the uppers, you actually just need to do the lower. Off camera, I kind of clean those intake ports a little bit. This is a new gasket we're putting down. They're about $13, $14 usually. Make sure you position any wiring out of the way and not to get smushed by the intake manifold or get hidden under it and forget to be put back on. Just slide the intake manifold back over. You kind of position it down, it'll kind of hit like a first stage, and then it should drop right back down on. So see, it's kind of rocky. You don't want to have that. You want that to drop right down. It should not be up on anything. Basically, you want to make sure it's positioned down and be able to move a little bit, and then you're just going to want to put those 6 bolts back in place. Make sure she's nice and flat. Put the 6 bolts back in. There's only one on this back side. That other thing is just a casting hole for the plastic. There's one up over by that throttle body. They're all the same length. You want to tighten in the sequence as I show. That way the gasket will be nice and flat and no leaks. Reconnect your evap purge line connections, and then reconnect the throttle body connection. Make sure the safety clips are engaged. At this point I put the harness back in place on the manifold on the 3 spots. Then if you removed your PCV hose, make sure you put that back in. You're going to reconnect it to the valve cover, make sure it snaps and hear that audible click. Then we're also, right now I'm positioning the vacuum brake booster hose back on its spot. Getting the clamp back positioned, and then make sure that map sensor is plugged in. Position the power steering reservoir back in place and tighten the 10mm bolts. And then put the bolts back in for the coolant bleed line and tighten those down as well. And they just got to be snug. Place the air ducting back in place, tighten the 8mm clamps. Make sure it's perfectly on both sides before you tighten the clamps up. And then also make sure to reposition that crankcase breather hose and securely clip it onto the ducting. Then after that, everything's connected, you're good to go. Put your engine cover back on and start your car up, and you just did your tune-up.